grammar. This single word has struck fear and panic into even the most accomplished student and, dare I say, adult. But why? At the core of its function, grammar focuses on identifying the many rules that create a linguistic system and a manner of explaining said rules. This, however, becomes more complicated when one views language as a living entity in society, constantly changing as the world itself changes. And therefore, the rules which the grammar of a certain language attempts to define cannot restrict itself to past structures and uses, but instead morph alongside the language itself. Teaching English as a second language thoroughly highlights this concept of grammar, as simply providing students with a list of definitions and a rigid understanding of how language should be communicated interferes with their ability to create functional discourse and allow them to express and understand others' expressions within society. Burke furthers this argument by stating that traditional grammar is often inaccurate and subjective and tends to ignore actual usage. Despite this, the principle of traditional grammar teaching is still utilised in schools where discourse, particularly the written text, is corrected to fit a certain model. So what grammar theories should a 21st century English teacher navigate towards, especially in an ESL context? This presentation will critically evaluate the shifting views from traditional prescriptive grammar to modern descriptive theories, such as Chomsky and Halliday's perspectives, to evaluate their effectiveness within the classroom and beyond into society as a whole. Throughout history, those who could write had a powerful weapon, as they could document and define the world, as well as pertaining the ability to express themselves. It was therefore highly valued to have the knowledge of correct grammar, and this value was displayed from the ancient Greeks through the Middle Ages and cemented its place within schools by the 19th century, with little change to the method of teaching the components of grammar over these timeframes. This traditional perspective, also known as formal or prescriptive, focuses specifically on form. That is, it allows an individual to identify the many parts of discourse and understand how each is used to create acceptable sentences. The aim with prescriptive grammar is to deconstruct text to pinpoint the building blocks of language within it easily and use this information to comprehend and respond to said text, as well as to express themselves clearly through their own communication, focusing specifically on written text. An example of this theory found within an ESL classroom may be a basic lesson on verbs, where students are taught the formal definition of a verb, shown verbs underlined in constructed sentences by the teacher, and then students are prompted to find verbs in other written sentences. This traditionalist approach does allow for a foundation of language and its elements to be learnt, which is an important role in language acquisition. However, its effectiveness is hindered through one flaw: it doesn't take context into consideration. Ignoring oral discourse and practical language presents a problem for all language learners, but especially impedes upon those who are learning a second language, as they have not been raised with the language and therefore do not have knowledge of the culture to which it belongs and how language is actually used within that culture. Wise, Jones and Bradford explain that a traditionalist complaint of incorrect grammar is derived either from a dislike of style, where the individual sentences actually make sense but are not written in the approved manner, or it doesn't fit the standard English dialect, which is only one of the many functional and spoken dialects. Consequently, if an individual wants to learn a language from another culture simply through the traditional teachings, they would often find that actually conversing with another person would be challenging, as although the conversation is grammatically correct, the language itself is not being used in a real culturally acceptable manner. During the 20th century, scholars throughout many parts of the world became frustrated with the limitations of traditional grammar, and soon another grammar theory rose into popularity: structuralist applied grammar. Although there were many researchers who have ties to structuralism, it's Leonard Bloomfield whose name is synonymous with this theory through the publication of his book Language. Bloomfield argues that when it comes to language acquisition and teaching, oral discourse is considered a priority and takes away the subjectivity aforementioned in regards to style. The structuralist approach understands that speech is not a perfect text. It often breaks many of the traditionalist rules, and yet it is accepted, used, and reciprocated. Grammar is therefore taught through organising a language into structures and patterns and analysing these through their immediate constitute analysis method to develop templates for one's own communication. The teaching of this method within an ESL classroom setting would be to display sentences transcribed from a conversation between two people, identify structures and patterns within this conversation, and then placing these structures together with other words to form acceptable dialogue. These templates, although broad and descriptive, still follow the basic assumption that language is created through a specific syntax order, resulting in similar robotic dialogue which is seen when teaching with the traditionalist approach. As a language teacher, I see the value in students learning the IC analysis and understanding the many ways in which these structures are often placed together to form sentences. In fact, in my personal experience with ESL students, has shown me that many appreciate learning rules as it helps them at the beginning to grasp parts of the new language. However, in the same regard as the traditionalist theory, I desire my students to not only understand grammatical rules, but develop their competence in conversations outside the classroom, where they can grasp the concept that perfectly structured sentences are not the foundation to the majority of discussions which they will encounter. So with continued research in language, grammar, and particularly the human psyche over the later half of the 20th century, the need for new perspectives of linguistics and grammar was evident. The prescriptive theory of grammar was challenged and soon began being replaced by the descriptive grammar theories, which describes language as it is, not as it should be. Modern descriptive grammar has multiple branches, however, two which have had great influence on grammar teaching in both mainstream and ESL context are Chomsky's universal grammar and Halliday's functional grammar theories. Noam Chomsky, a cognitive scientist, political activist, and lecturer, has been at the forefront of descriptive grammar theories since the 1950s, and unlike many other philosophers, his views on language acquisition and the teaching of grammar have adjusted throughout the decades in response to the growing research conducted in these fields. Chomsky's theories are based on a core belief that linguistics is part of psychology, that language is developed and designed in the mind. Therefore, in order to understand an individual's language, one must also understand their internalized meaning. Furthermore, universal grammar theory investigates the innate ability for young children to acquire specific complex language systems with only basic data to draw from, and how this occurrence displays a set of instinctive grammar principles which supports use and learning of language. After researching the universal grammar theory and reading numerous explanations of its goals within the educational field, there are a few of its foundational beliefs which, as a teacher, I appreciate. Firstly, there's an acknowledgement that there is still so far to go in the understanding of second language acquisition, and the researchers do not pretend to have a simple method of teaching grammar to a second language learner. Secondly, the more modern writings on this theory clearly state that there needs to be a continuum between teaching meaning in language and still providing individuals with the knowledge of grammatical rules. However, the theory put forward by Chomsky, as well as a plethora of other researchers, also argues that the importance of understanding the role which these grammatical rules play within language, also known as language awareness. However, the theory put forward by Chomsky, as well as a plethora of other researchers, also argues that the importance of understanding the role which these grammatical rules play within the language, also known as language awareness, and how it is used in society is the real answer to seeing what would have been external learning to the individual all of a sudden become an internal process through the introduction of critical thinking. So what does this process actually look like in a classroom? Unlike the prescriptive grammar theories aforementioned, universal grammar theory does not aim to help students understand the various grammar rules, flexible or otherwise, displayed in dialogue, but instead is focused on presenting dialogue to individuals and guiding them to discover the patterns in their own manner and therefore uncovering their own grammar. For example, one could provide students with a tabloid magazine article and a newspaper article, ask questions about the sentences they see, compare the language seen in both, and prompt students to identify for themselves patterns which they see occurring. But despite the approval many education professionals have towards Chomsky's grammar theories, students still need to be aware of fundamental grammatical elements previous to them being able to deconstruct a text to find these elements, and as a result of a teacher's approach to developing one's second language acquisition cannot be based solely on the universal grammar principles. The final grammar theory being critiqued is Halliday's systematic functional theory, which was first developed in the 1950s and has continued to evolve through research ever since. Halliday developed his linguistic theory around the notion that language should be viewed as a complex system, where language is not simply a body of rules, rather a combination of use, reason, roles, meaning, and preference. It goes deeper than viewing and identifying words. It explores how an individual connects with the cultural context surrounding them and uses these to make meaning through language. Therefore, language is seen as the foundation for building human experience. This meaning in language is proposed to be derived from three meta-functions. Additional, where language is used to discuss the world and our experiences in it. Interpersonal, which is how we exchange discourse with others. And textual, describing how coherent messages are formed. Unlike prescriptive and some descriptive grammar methods, SFG places emphasis on the teacher being thoroughly aware of how texts are designed, how language is chosen, and in these texts, how the language chosen in these texts demonstrates the context surrounding it and what the purpose of said text is. Another difference between SFG and other theories aforementioned is that Halliday views a clause as a fundamental unit of grammar, and therefore that is what is analysed as opposed to a sentence. Using FSG as an ESL teacher allows for additional activities to be incorporated into a grammar lesson, where students are given the opportunity to recognise the purpose of language and use their own understanding of social context to discuss and analyse language choice. Dr. Annabelle Lucan, an Australian lecturer on linguistics, wrote about a sample lesson where a newspaper article is read, discussed, and is broken into cause and effect relationships. Discussions are then based on language used to bind the cause and effect ideas together and its purpose. Complex clauses are then discussed and designed. Students write about their own view on the cause and effect discussed in the article, and this process is then repeated with another text. This process is time-consuming, highly dependent on the teacher's own knowledge of text design, and quite complicated. In fact, some argue that SFG lacks the simplicity needed to present this theory to teachers, and that Halliday provides little evidence to support his statement. So the question still remains, what's a teacher to do? Each theory contains positive and negative elements when implementing its grammar principles in an ESL context. However, as a 21st century teacher, for me it is obvious that the traditional perspective theory truly fails to provide students with an understanding of the function of language, and for this reason I believe finding a balance between Chomsky's universal grammar and Halliday's SFG is a more appropriate option to allow students to be competent producers of language. By drawing students' attention to the influence of language and the methods of successful communication as opposed to grammar instruction, I am offering them a chance to truly comprehend the society in which they live, and through this, changing the balance of power in their favour.